Welcome back to Levant TV's press review for Monday the 25th of November. Today's main story is the Iran nuclear deal sealed in Geneva. It was dubbed historic, just not by Israel. And like other human rights violations in radical rebel control areas in Syria, we take a look at human trafficking where poverty has led to parents selling their own daughters. But first, let's take a look at papers here in the UK. Starting with the Daily Telegraph, which leads its front page reporting on Bulgarian Ambassador Konstantin Dimitrov, saying that not a single work permit request has been rejected in the past 6 years, despite promise to protect British jobs. It also reports on Transport Secretary Patrick McLaughlan, saying that doubters and defeatists fighting HS2 cannot be allowed to dictate the future of Britain. And The Guardian leads its front page giving coverage to the Geneva talks, where there has been a historic agreement on Iran's nuclear program. The paper says it was made possible by months of unprecedented secret meetings running parallel to official negotiations. It also reports on hospitals creating thousands of beds, hiring more staff and getting doctors to work longer shifts in a frantic effort to avoid the NHS being crippled by major problems this winter, and also reports on the couple accused of holding 3 women as slaves being linked to 13 addresses. The Independent leads its front page reporting on an investigation by Hope Not Hate, which says a network of groups led by Islamist preacher Anjem Choudhury has become the single biggest gateway to terrorism in recent British history. Similar to many other front pages today, it also covers the Iran nuclear agreement, saying now the hard part begins. The Times leads its front page reporting that illegal drugs and guns are still being sold with impunity on the dark internet, despite police claims to have shut down the most sophisticated and criminal marketplace. It also features a picture of Robbie Williams, whose album Swings Both Ways became the 1000th #1 album, and of course covers the Iran nuclear agreement, branding it a bad agreement. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As Iran secures a nuclear deal with the superpowers, Israel feels threatened by the deal and calls it a historic mistake. Let's take a look at various papers analyzing the issue. Al Monitor features an article headline, "The Deal with Iran and What Comes Next," in which it looks at the Iran nuclear deal reached yesterday in Geneva. According to the writer, the joint plan of action not only an initial step in dealing with Iran's nuclear program, but also for broader issues of regional security in the Middle East. The article features US Secretary of State John Kerry, who addressed critics of the deal when he said today there are those who will assert that this deal is imperfect, while they too bear responsibility, and that is to tell people what the better alternative is. The writer believes that the alternative would be more sanctions, which would be likely result in less monitoring, more centrifuges, more enrichment, above 5%, further development at Natanz, Fordo and Iraq, a possible end to negotiations as Iran hardliners would undercut President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, and increase prospects for a military strike. The writer goes on to say that it is hard to see how the objective of preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon is served over the next 6 months by this alternative. The writer continues to say the deal with Iran and the concurrent positive trend in US-Iran ties has alarmed US allies in the region, especially Israel and Saudi Arabia. He says alternatively, the first step agreement could be seen as not only buying time on Iran's nuclear program with the prospects for a comprehensive deal, but also as the beginning of a shift away from the bitter hostility between Israel and Iran. The writer points out that such a shift in the relationship that dare not to speak its name is not so far-fetched when one considers the role that Russia can play as a broker in this exchange. The writer quotes Fyodor Lukyanov, who wrote Moscow's stature has witnessed a surge because of its role in Syria, including collaboration on the chemical weapons framework, which led to UN Security Council Resolution 2118 passed unanimously on September the 27th. The writer sees that Moscow also played a role in engaging Iran on Syria, and the nuclear agreement today should allow deeper consultations on Syria. Moscow's proven good offices in dealing with Damascus and Tehran has been bolstered further with the return of Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman. The writer says that the growing consensus among Turkey, Iraq and Iran on Syria is good news for a political solution and bad news for terrorists and arms groups seeking to overthrow the Syrian government, and will serve over time to contain the efforts at autonomy by the Kurds of Syria. So taken together, if these trends continue and the situation in Syria begins to stabilize, the prospects to diffuse tension on the Israeli-Lebanon border are potentially greater than ever, as Hezbollah can only begin to draw down when there is peace with Israel. The writer argues that if both the United States and Iran are serious about sanctions relief, a conversation needs to happen about Iran, Israel and Hezbollah, which is listed by the United States as a terrorist group, but backed by Iran. And to conclude, the writer says these changes will not happen overnight. If they happen at all, the agreement in Geneva is of course only a first step, but it is a big step and in the right direction for US policy and regional security in the Middle East. Reporting for the Huffington Post, Lovert Lustig writes an article headline, Iran deal Syria sacrificed, in which he looks at the for and against points of the Iran nuclear deal. According to Lustig, Iran gets an immediate partial unfreezing of some of its sanctions hits assets and the prospect of further unfreezing in the months to come if further talks bear fruit. Win-win, everybody happy except of course the anti-Obama camp in Washington and the anti-Rouhani camp in Tehran. Lustig indicates that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't trust the Iranians, never has, never will, to keep their word. Lustig sees that Netanyahu is convinced that whatever it may say in Geneva, Iran still intends to develop the bomb and to threaten Israel's decade-long preeminence as the Middle East's only nuclear-capable state. Lustig expects Netanyahu to take some kind of unilateral military action, probably against Iranian-backed elements in Gaza, Lebanon or Syria, to demonstrate that Israel is determined to protect what it regards as its essential security interests. In Tel Aviv, anything that could be seen as good for Iran must be bad for Israel. Lustig claims that the view from Riyadh is odd similar. The Saudi royals hate the idea of Washington finding a new interlocutor in the region, and they especially hate the idea that it should be the Shia clerics in Tehran with whom the Americans can now do business. The writer sees that for decades the Saudi, together with the Egyptians, have been Washington's go-to people in the Middle East, and strengthening Iran's position on the world stage is absolutely the last thing they wanted. One of the biggest fears over the Iran nuclear program has long been that if Tehran really did develop a nuclear weapon, the Saudis would feel compelled to do the same. Lustig refers to the Syrian situation, indicating that Iran has been by far Bashar al-Assad's most important ally since the start of the uprising against him. If Iran is stronger today than it was yesterday, so is President Assad. If Washington and Tehran can do business on the nuclear issue, so perhaps they can on Syria. And if they do, you can be sure of one thing, President Assad will stay in power, at least in the short term. Lustig argues that with regards to Syria, their seizing of their initiative over Syria's chemical weapons arsenal paid handsome dividends and successfully diverted the world's attention away from the Syrian bloodbath. Their allies in Damascus and Tehran look more secure. The political dividend for Barack Obama is relatively slight. And to conclude, Lustig says if the deal sticks, something huge has changed in the Middle East. The balance of power has shifted. Whether you welcome that or fear it will depend on what you think of President Rouhani and how much of a moderate he really is. The Independent features an article written by Robert Fisk and headlined, he may huff and puff, but Benjamin Netanyahu is on his own now as nuclear agreement isolates Israel. Where Fisk considers in his article the outcomes of the Iran nuclear deal and its effect on Israel and other countries in the region. According to Fisk, the nuclear agreement marks a victory for the Shia in their growing conflict with the Sunni Muslim Middle East. It gives substantial hope to Bashar al-Assad that he will be left in power in Syria. It isolates Israel and infuriates Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Kuwait and other Sunni Gulf states. These states, Fisk claims, secretly hope that a breakdown of the Geneva nuclear talks would humiliate Shia Iran and support their efforts to depose Assad, Iran's only ally in the Arab world. Fisk sees that Iran's sudden offer to negotiate a high-speed end to the cancerous threat of further war was thus greeted with almost manic excitement by the US and the EU, along with theatrical enthusiasm by the man who realized that his own country has been further empowered in the Middle East, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Assad's continued tenure in Damascus is assured peace in our time. But Fisk argues that there's no doubt that Geneva has called Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's bluff. He may huff and puff, but if he wants to bash Iran now on the basis that Israel must remain the only nuclear nation in the Middle East, he's going to be on his own when his planes take off to bomb Iran's nuclear plans. Fisk argues if Mr. Netanyahu and his clique in the government decide to twit the words major powers amidst their euphoria, he may bring about the most profound change in Israel's relation with the US since the foundation of the Israeli state. It would not be a change for Israel's benefit. To conclude, Fisk states that Mr. Rouhani or Ayatollah Khamenei say that the fear of an Iranian nuclear weapon will be seen by future generations as a historical joke. Netanyahu says the whole shenanigans in Geneva will prove to be a historic mistake. The Sunni Saudis always wait to spot the winner before opening their mouth, have already sat down with the Sunni Qatari and Kuwaiti allies to commiserate with each other over Shia Iran's new victory. As reports emerge of more than 11,000 children to have died in the Syrian war since it started in March 2011, let's take a look at analysis on various aspects surrounding the conflict. Writing for International Business Times, Vasudevan Shirdihan reports a shocking account of virgins sold in Syria refugee camps for $300. Shirdihan quotes 22-year-old Amani, who lives in a refugee camp in Zatari near the border with Jordan, who says, "I would have sold myself, but Amara was the only virgin in our family. We had to sell her in order to allow the rest of us to survive. What else could I do?" Sridharan says the 20-year-old Tamani, mother of 5 children, was reportedly left with no choice but to give away her sister to look after her own family. He adds that reports from the region suggest several Jordanians, Saudis and Egyptians are on the hunt for virgins, as some of the desperately poor Syrian parents are willing to give up their teenage girls in return for money. He quotes Samani saying, "I have seen Jordanians, Egyptians and Saudis passing by the tents in search of a virgin to take along. They pay $300 and they get the girl of their dreams." Sridharan adds that in Syria, girls commonly get married before the age of 18, but the concept of early marriage is being deeply dented by the crises. Families often find it best to sell off their girls, fearing rape and abduction in the refugee camps. He concludes that the international aid agencies, governments and the United States and the United Nations are stunned by the sheer scale of the refugee crisis, dubbing it as one of the most challenging in this generation. Eurasia's review, Manish Rai, takes a look at the prospects of the Geneva II peace conference titled Syria Road to Geneva II, littered with bumps. Rai says while efforts are underway to make a peace conference on Syria possible, the surrounding atmospheres are not encouraging, as opposition groups in the Syrian conflict seem to still have reservations and preconditions. Referring to the preconditions laid out by Syrian opposition, Rai says the Western-backed Syrian National Coalition, the main opposition group in exile, threw a monkey wrench into the planned peace talks in Geneva, saying that it won't attend the Geneva II peace conference. He points out that Lakhdar Ibrahimi, UN and Arab League envoy to Syria said that the National Coalition of Syria is placing preconditions for its participation, which is creating problems for declaring dates for the conference. Rai says that rejection of the peace talks from the opposition raises a valid question mark on the viability of the conference, as who are directly confronting the Syrian government in the battlefield are not willing to talk. Drawing light on the fragmented rebel views, Rai adds that various rebel groups on ground, including the most powerful Al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, have stated that they are neither interested in the peace talks nor recognize the coalition. Rai believes that the entire heap of problems appears due to the Syrian opposition that disintegrates into separate groups. Each opposition group possesses its own point of view, while armed groups declare independence from the national coalition or even hint at their alliance with Al-Qaeda. Rai continues that those who fund and arm these opposition groups will be responsible for the expected failure of Geneva II talks, as each opposition group in Syria has its sponsor abroad. The countries which are supporting the Syrian opposition are undermining the Geneva II peace conference on the Syrian conflict, as they just want their agendas to be pushed into Syria rather than any peace and stability. Rai adds that the international community must convince all sides to put aside preconditions and not to be adamant, saying who can and who cannot be at the table and participate in the talks with the open mind. He concludes by emphasizing that the world community should understand that the troubled atmosphere engulfing the Conference of Geneva II will have, in one way or another, deep impact on the progress of peace in the whole Middle East. The conference's failure will discredit the political solution at large and be a boon to those who advocate the military option. So for the greater good, all the stakeholders should encourage this peace initiative, which is very much required for the stability and peace of the region. Fast News reports on Saudi Arabia's shadow war, saying that now that Saudi Arabia has largely abandoned hope that the United States will spearhead international efforts to topple President Assad, it is embarking on a major new effort to train Syrian rebel force, and according to a source, it is getting the help of Pakistani instructors to do so. Fast News reports that the ramped-up Saudi effort has been spurred by the kingdom's disillusionment with the United States. A Saudi insider with knowledge of the program described how Riyadh had determined to move ahead with its plans after coming to the conclusion that President Obama was simply not prepared to move aggressively to oust Assad. It reports the source saying, "We didn't know if the Americans would give in or not, but nothing ever came through. Now we know the president just didn't want it." It also adds that Pakistan's role is so far relatively small, though another source with knowledge of Saudi thinking said that the plan was currently being debated to give Pakistan responsibility for training 2 rebel brigades. It adds that Carnegie Middle East Center fellow Yazid Sayegh first noted the use of Pakistani instructors, writing that the Saudis were planning to build a Syrian rebel army of roughly 40,000 to 50,000 soldiers. Interestingly, it suggests that while some say Saudi Arabia's decision to train the Syrian militants is taking place independent of the United States and its latest sign of a split between the 2 longtime allies, a second group believes that such words are just propaganda and the program has actually been devised and supervised by the CIA. Fast News reports that source saying that Saudi effort relies on a network of Riyadh's allies in addition to Pakistan, such as Jordan, the UAE and France. Pointing out the relationship between Saudi and Pakistan, it states that the current Pakistani government in particular is closely tied to Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was ousted from power in 1999 by a military coup. The Saudis allegedly brokered a deal that kept him from prison. Sharif would spend the next 7 years in exile, mainly in Saudi Arabia. However, it adds that Pakistan is already grappling with its own sectarian bloodshed and must mind its relationship with Iran, while its foreign policy is focused on negotiations with the Taliban over the future of Afghanistan and its long-time rivalry with India. According to Sayegh, Jordan is also reportedly leery about fielding a large Syrian rebel army on its soil. The ambitious Saudi plan would require a level of support from Amman that is supposed within the security and military establishment and is unlikely to be implemented. It quotes David Ottaway, a scholar at the Wilson Center, who wrote a biography of Prince Bandar, who says, "Could the Saudis force to cooperate? I have my doubts." Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. The International New York Times leads its front page with the headline, "A nuclear pause but issues remain," as it says the Iran nuclear agreement is a modest step towards goal of extending time to build a weapon. Iran's Tehran Times leads its front page with the headline, "The deal is done," as it covers the historic agreement. And Russia's Moscow Times leads with the headline, "Ukraine's Moscow move sparks protests," as tens of thousands of people take to the streets on Kiev. And finally, the UAE's Gulf News leads its front page with the headline, "Secret US-Iran talks paved way for Geneva talks," as it says negotiations held in Oman and elsewhere with only a few people in the know. That was it for today. Perhaps a deal against the odds in Geneva. What's worth following up now is the inhumane crisis in Syrian refugee camps, a disgrace to human and women's rights. I'll see you tomorrow for Tuesday's press review.